Aloha. Today I want to talk to you about anxiety and how video games are uniquely positioned as an art form to encourage that kind of reaction in their players. Now, that's not to say that other artistic media aren't also capable of provoking similar stresses in their audiences. The Thick of It, Inside Number 9, and films such as Boiling Point, Uncut Gems, and Sweet Smell of Success are all good examples of audiovisual art that has achieved that for me in recent watches. But as with so many of its endeavours, the video game industry has the benefit of interactivity on a level that no other new media can really rival. In every second of gameplay, you're usually making a number of vital decisions, and far from being overwhelmed by the unpredictability of their players, the best games can harness this peculiar angle and use it to affect each of us on a personal level. And for me, a huge horror fan, the best games are usually those that go bump in the night. The two-way nature of the experiences that they offer mean that we are dropped into the world in which these terrible events are happening, and we have to survive the very same scenarios that give even the toughest protagonists some serious PTSD. And above all, the best experiences that I've had with horror games have been those that, although incredibly fun, also have me like Isaac at the start of Dead Space 2, just running and screaming and yelling expletives as the world falls apart around me. Games that get the heart rate going and don't let up until you've somehow, against all odds, survived the night, or the scene, or even just the moment. And in this video, I'm going to look at two games that, in very different ways, injected that panic into my playthrough, and how reflecting on them a few years ago now finally allowed me to finish the first Resident Evil. So this was the first video that I ever really outlined, a full 2 years before I actually got around to making the channel, so you're getting this almost 4 years late. Sorry about that. However, when I first jotted down my thoughts, a young and innocent child, I had just been playing through my second attempt at the first and, at the time, only Resident Evil Remake. And it was my second attempt because, back when I was like 16, I had tried to work my way through the game for the first time and had hit a bit of a barrier. I didn't really know the series at the time, but things had been going well. I jumped in as Jill, started setting about my mansion adventure, and was thoroughly enjoying myself as I did so. But there was something that seemed a little off to me. I didn't really think twice about it, but having to use ink ribbons at typewriters in order to save the game did seem a bit odd. I guess I just assumed that the whole thing was to get us to return to certain points as we left the game, and so that we couldn't just save whenever we wanted to, which is not necessarily conducive to a good horror atmosphere. In fact, at the time, this opinion was largely informed by a recent replay of Alien Isolation, which I'd still consider a top 10 game, and which was probably my third or fourth favourite that I'd ever played at that particular point in my life. In that game, as with many other horror titles, you can only save at specific areas on the map, meaning that you're made all the more vulnerable as you set off in search of the next objective, and that surviving to the point where you are able to save your game feels like a huge achievement. Vulnerability is a huge part of the horror genre as a whole, of course, because if you're invulnerable, then why would anything be scary to you? And this is something that I really enjoy in the way that it's used in games that aren't afraid to send you back to the start of a level when you get caught by the big scary monster. There's a sense throughout of the loss that you're desperate to avoid, and you don't always get that in other games where death is only punished with a short trip back to one of the regular checkpoints, or in some games like Doom Eternal, or some of the Mario series, isn't punished at all. And to look at a game that I played recently, Soma, we can see that I still hold this standard after all these years, as despite the fact that I do still think of Soma as an excellent game, it did feel a little diminished in some of its scarier areas by the fact that the option was there to just save the game whenever I wanted, removing the sense of jeopardy that comes from the fear of losing your progress. So this is the kind of thing that I was thinking and expecting as I first absorbed the halls of the mansion in Resident Evil, and it was only after I played through a couple of hours, or maybe even more, of the story, that I put two and two together with regards to the ink ribbons. Because, of course, there are only a set number of those things around the map, meaning that there was a limit on the number of times that I could save the game, and that, were I to use them up too early, I might not be able to finish it altogether. Now, I generally don't use all that many saves, and I certainly wasn't spending an ink ribbon every time I got the chance, but nonetheless, this was like someone flicking a switch in my head. What had been a really fun game for me thus far instead became something of a daunting challenge through which I felt, well, unable to progress. I didn't want to restart the game and eke them all out because I'd just done all of that work and it would feel like a chore rather than something interesting. And I didn't want to use some guide to look up when was best to save because that would also take the fun out of the experience, personally speaking. And talking about it now, I feel really stupid, but it was just like a mental block at that point in time that soured that feeling of wanting to continue with the game. I soon lost all excitement and I stopped playing for a while, which turned into forever. Or so it seemed that it would when I uninstalled the game, but happily, there were some twists down the road. Beyond Resident Evil 4, which served as a direct inspiration for the game, Dead Space is about as classic a 21st century action horror as you're ever likely to find. It received near universal acclaim and won a litany of awards and went on to produce 2 excellent sequels, one of which is considered the pinnacle of the series, and the remake from earlier this year, which received similar plaudits pretty much all round. And the first game is an incredibly tense experience, which is achieved through unparalleled sound design, a stunning and atmospheric setting, a fully immersive in-world HUD, and a sidestepping of the more standard set of scripted events in favour of more spontaneous and organic encounters. Even as a player sitting on a sofa with a can of Coke and, crucially, the ability to pause the game or turn it off whenever I pleased, I never felt safe from what Dead Space had up its sleeve. And even more impressively, that feeling remains to this day, despite my having played it several times and growing comfortable with the enemies and the experience as a whole. And for me, this is exemplified by one moment in particular. Or, well, not in particular. Because that's the thing about the best scare in Dead Space. There's no guarantee that it will happen at any one point in the game, or rather that it won't at any other point. I've had entire playthroughs where it never occurred, and several where it happened with frightening frequency. I'm speaking, of course, about the safe room scares, moments when, according to the rules of horror games, and you might have thought of Dead Space, you're safe. There's a save point on the wall, there's a workbench to upgrade your weapons, there don't appear to be any enemies, and the music has died down a little from its usual erratic self. These spaces are chances to recuperate, to prepare yourself for the next leg of your journey, and to go about inventory management or similar tasks, which are especially necessary in Dead Space, given that the game does not pause during these moments, meaning that you need to find somewhere nice and quiet to get working on whatever it is that needs working on. But Dead Space says no to this morsel of respite, and there's a chance that you'll be attacked by one of the game's many enemies in those moments where you think you're safe. For the rest of the game, or even for the rest of the series, you always feel vulnerable as the usual rules have been thrown out the window, and there's no moment where you're allowed to feel secure. You're never able to leave that fight or flight mode, which makes the experience all the more terrifying, especially in light of the game's unpredictability in both enemy spawning and in its pacing, which is intentionally abnormal so that no big fight comes with a guaranteed easy or safe feeling afterwards. There are no cutscenes that take the game fully out of your hands, and none after the opening that last for more than a few seconds. Whereas other games might use cinematics to deliver subtle precision and particular timing that are perfectly designed to terrify the player, they often seem to contain cheap scares or predictable horror, at least by comparison to Dead Space, as we know that the character is going to survive until the end. Instead, Dead Space does away with any notion of subtlety and simply has us constantly on edge. There is no moment in the game where you can be sure that you won't be impaled in the coming seconds, and even the safe spots are now infiltrated in order to reinforce the growing sense of paranoia on the player's part. For me, this is an exhilarating experience, and one that really helped me to embrace the anxiety of the horror genre and how it can be utilised so effectively in a video game. But Dead Space wasn't the only experience that would go on to be an essential element of my appreciation for that aspect of horror games, and the second title in question, more a psychological horror than an old-school scarefest, was Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade is a game in which the protagonist's anxiety is a core tenet of the experience of both the character in question, Senua, that is, and the players trying to guide her through her quest. The narrative revolves around one woman literally going to hell and back to try and free her boyfriend from the nightmarish prison realm of the dead, where he is doomed to spend the rest of eternity. That's right, Senua's story is in fact a direct rip-off of Lisa Simpson's from the Simpsons movie.
Lisa's got a boyfriend that she'll never see again.
And a fundamental part of how the game makes you feel the pains of her plight is through Well, still through imparting a sense of vulnerability in the player, but it actually does this using the opposite method to that of Dead Space. Whereas in that game we are constantly on edge, never letting down our guard so that we are always ready to tear apart any threat that might rear its ugly, ugly head, Hellblade instead takes that power away from us. See, Senua's psychosis and anxiety, the latter being voiced by a bunch of people dancing around a microphone, are constantly clawing away at her, and as we hear it and feel it too, also at us. We become the subject of her self-criticisms, inherently tying us to her fate, but also replicating the effect that causes such suffering in the character. There is never a moment of freedom from that which endangers her the most, which is not the horde of hell that constantly tries to consume her, or even this cool demon dog that chases her through these tunnels, but the darkness eating away at her from within. However, as the combat in Hellblade is relatively simple, Dead Space's constant fear of the necromorph threat wouldn't apply to Hellblade's demons and gods of the underworld. Instead of seeking to make the player relentlessly fearful, Hellblade simply targets another area of its players' minds, working to make them feel as emotionally and mentally vulnerable as Senua, and doing so through its heavy reliance on cutscenes. The time between them is almost exclusively occupied by puzzles and the aforementioned combat, neither of which are all that tough or particularly complicit in Senua's degeneration. However, as she suffers the voices in her head, unable to cope with the intense pressure of pleasing them, we are given the same treatment, creating an unusual atmosphere in which dying is not the primary fear of the player, with the emotionally draining cutscenes, each of which seems to exacerbate Senua's situation, instead providing the truest sense of vulnerability. We have no control, no ability to set things right or to save her from damnation, and that is what becomes most terrifying. And there's one excellent feature that truly amazed me when I came to understand it and its function in Hellblade, which is, actually, it's a crucial part of the experience of playing the game, and discovering it, if you haven't, might have an adverse effect upon your playthrough, so spoilers, I guess, which is the game's death mechanic. In the early stages of Hellblade, a darkness starts to spread from Senua's hand and up towards her head. Each time you die in-game, this continues a little further, and you are told that with each death, the rot will continue to climb up her arm. Should it ever reach her head, she will well and truly die, instituting a permadeath, and thus meaning that players who reach this point will have to restart the game from the very beginning. This created in me a sense of tension and a source of stress, as, although I didn't die all that much thanks to the very forgiving combat, I was afraid of what I'd lose if the game had a difficulty spike or if the darkness otherwise spread too far. And bizarrely, I believe that the ease with which you can fend off Hela's undead forces actually make this a lot worse, as you probably won't die 30 or 40 times throughout the game, instead only failing on a small handful of occasions after perhaps making some silly mistakes. And as the rot grows further up her arm, which it inevitably does anyway as you progress through the story, regardless of how many times you're killed, you get to wondering how many more times you'll be forgiven. It has you questioning your every move, and afraid of what might be around the corner, and as with Dead Space's ending after all those moments of terror, makes it feel like such an achievement when you finally do finish the game. But here's the thing. There never actually is any permadeath mechanic. You will never be able to die enough times in the game that it will wipe your progress. And this is what I meant about the easier combat actually making it quite scary. Because if you die 24 times and see that the darkness hasn't actually spread that far, then you'll probably get to thinking, actually this game is very lenient. Whereas if you only die twice in the first half of the game and you see that it's spread halfway up your arm, you're going to treat each life as more valuable and be more afraid of what you can lose. See, the idea of a permadeath mechanic is given to us so that we will feel the same dread as Senua, the same fear of a death that actually punishes us rather than just making us replay the last 2 minutes of the game, or whatever. Remember earlier when I said that I prefer for there to be jeopardy in how the save systems in horror games work? Well, this game, second only to my original attempt at playing through Resident Evil, created a real sense of that throughout my playthrough, and as such helped to open my eyes to the qualities inherent in introducing a sort of extra diegetic threat, only without actually endangering the game's players, and instead simply enhancing our experience through reaching beyond the screen and into our world. These two games were essential in my developing an understanding of what it is that games seek to achieve by giving players a limited number of saves, or pulling similar moves. I had actually played Dead Space prior to my first attempt at Resident Evil, but I never truly appreciated the way in which it invoked those aforementioned feelings until I was replaying it with the experience that I'd had with Resident Evil. at which point my increased understanding of Dead Space helped me to enjoy a game that I'd previously given up on. And Hellblade, another innovative game from a different era and area of horror, also managed to get me to look at the original Resident Evil Remake in a new light, facilitating a better experience for me as a player enjoying an unrelated game that came out 15 years before Senua's story was released. For me, this whole saga was a key moment in realizing the subjectivity of art. Having these experiences changed what I was able to enjoy, to the extent that I was able to climb a hill that had previously felt insurmountable, for whatever reason. It was like solving one of Resident Evil's puzzles, unlocking a new pathway and using that to progress to a place where I could see things differently, and for the better. In making this video, I was hoping that it might give someone a chance to appreciate an element of horror games that they might not have thought about otherwise, but I was also hoping that this might encourage them to look from a new perspective at games that they never got round to finishing. It doesn't have to be horror at all, but your favourite genres of video game or even films or books or whatever art it is that you enjoy the most probably has a lot of great moments and qualities that you might have overlooked or never even experienced in the first place. And whether it's through checking out something that you'd previously written off or returning to something that you put down a while back, there's something absolutely golden out there that I'm sure you'll be able to fully appreciate for the very first time. I hope that you enjoyed today's video, and as always, I'd love to hear from you. So if you have any thoughts on what I said, or any notes for me personally, please do leave them down in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Anyway, thanks again for watching this, and I look forward to seeing you next time.